Hello and welcome to Really Cool People, a podcast produced by Schweitzer Church. I'm your host, Jason Leininger. This is a place to hear stories of really cool people. The hope is that as you and I listen to these stories, we'll be inspired, encouraged, and challenged through moments of serendipity. In a sermon entitled The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis said, "There is no ordinary person. You and I have never talked to a mere mortal." It's my joy over the next few moments to introduce you to someone who may seem kind of ordinary, especially to themselves, and yet they are a really cool person. Today, we're going to meet Courtney Lazzaro. Courtney is in the stage of life that many of us call middle age, or that middle phase of life, where you've got parents who are retired and you're raising kids. And she and her husband, Chris, they gave great names to their kids, Atticus and Tolkien. Great names, great things for them to live up to. But she's got a great story as well. So I invite you, wherever you're at, to lean in, listen to Courtney's story, listen to the journey she's been on and the journey that is unfolding for her right now. Well, welcome, friends, and welcome, Courtney. So let's start with your story.
Okay. I was born in South Texas, right on the border with Mexico. My parents were migrant workers, so we traveled. We lived in South Texas, and then we would travel to California, where my mom's from. And my dad at that point, once I was born, worked packing melons. And then once I got to school age, we just did that in the summertime. And so it was kind of the best of both worlds because I had a stable family home, but then we got to travel and see different parts of the country. My dad's parents were also migrant workers, so it was kind of part of his culture. My mom's family was Italian-American. So my family culture was kind of this amalgam of like migrant worker, Italian, hippie Baptist. and
Did you just say migrant worker, Italian, hippie Baptist?
Hippie
all in
Baptist,
one sentence?
Yes. Yeah, it was just before I was born, my parents were real hippies. Once they started having kids, they were like, we need some religion. My mom got invited to a Baptist church and loved it. And
what is a real hippie?
Like, I guess I use the word hippie. There's not really an appropriate term for it. Like sold drugs in the desert.
Okay.
Followed Willie Nelson around concerts, okay. That kind of stuff.
Okay.
And they kind of kept some of that, like, free-flowing attitude, even though we ended up in a very, very strict Baptist church. And it was independent fundamental Baptist. So, they're the ones that think the Southern Baptists are liberals.
Yeah. Yes, they are.
And so that's where I grew up in that church, but at home, our home life was still very, I think, balanced. Like it was strict, but like loving. And then I went to the church school. So pretty much 6 days a week we're taken up with independent fundamental Baptist at home, but at home it was much more relaxed.
So when you think about that, what are some marks of things you picked up on from an independent fundamental Baptist? Like, what would be marks where you're like, I can tell when I'm in that kind of setting? Or 'cause some of us wouldn't. I mean, that would be unfamiliar to some of us.
On the surface, they seem pretty friendly, but when you dig a little deeper, women are pretty oppressed. They have no voice, no say in their lives. So they're pretty passive aggressive. It's a lot of. I was thinking recently, doing the John Mark Comer study, mm-hmm. and talking about the evolution of your faith, and I feel like I grew up knowing the God of the Old Testament because the God of the Old Testament is talked about a lot, but I didn't really know Jesus very well until my probably my 30s. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
And then what were some of the marks of your home life? I mean, because you kind of juxtapose those. So
A lot of like Willie Nelson playing in the background. In fact, Atticus got me Willie Nelson Stardust album for Christmas. And I listened to it all day and I just cried. It was like spending an afternoon with my dad. It was really special because my dad always sang along, and now he's had several strokes and he doesn't sing anymore. And that's one of the losses of stroke. It was just very, very loving. We spent lots of time outside. It was a mobile home. So we had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. And so my mom sent us outside a lot. And so lots of time outside. Lots of time, once we got to be like teenagers, lots of time with friends and at school and doing volleyball and basketball and all of those things. But home life was, I don't know, it was just, we had a good childhood. I've had a lot of time to reflect because my parents just moved away from there up to Springfield, but they moved away from our childhood home. And for my brother and sister and I, like we had to process our grief, and we had tears and a lot of feelings. And my mom, who was the one who worked so hard to make that very poor situation homey, she was the one that did all the work for 40 years. And so for her, it was like, bye. For us, it was a magical childhood, but she's the one that did the work to create the magical childhood.
Sure.
But our door was always open. People were always coming in and out, because we lived kind of at the crossroads of 2 different cultures or 2 different continents, not technically, but in a cultural sense. There was always people passing through. We had, undocumented immigrants that lived in our barn sometimes or would be part of our family life. And then we had people coming from the north who were coming down to study Spanish so they could go be missionaries in Mexico or South America or Central America. So it was very transitory. We would make really good friends and they would only be there for like a year or 2. But on the other hand, we'd know people everywhere. Like I joke that like wherever we travel, we know somebody, but also wherever we travel, we know somebody. Like,
two sides
sometimes
of that coin.
I just want to be alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it was good. Like I grew up as a minority in that region because it was 95% Hispanic. And so it was a good, very, very tiny, tiny taste of what it's like to be other in a predominantly different culture. I think all of those different cultures influenced our family as well. Then the teachers that church hired were from either Bob Jones University or Pensacola Christian College or Maranatha or Northland, which were both in Wisconsin. So those were the 4 choices of colleges I had when I went to college. Those were my choices. So
wow, that's an interesting selection of schools.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I chose Pensacola because it was warm and inexpensive, and I didn't like anything that I saw coming out of Bob Jones. Any teacher or leader I had in my life that was from Bob Jones was problematic in different ways. And so I just thought, I don't want to have anything to do with that. So I went to Pensacola, which is not that different, but it was different enough. I went 1 year and realized it wasn't for me. And then came back home. I did meet my husband there, but we didn't date for very long. We just met each other. And then I moved back home. We didn't really talk for a couple of years. And I worked 3 jobs and had a great time. I mean, I was 19, 20, 21 years old and had all the energy in the world. So it was fun. I learned a lot. And then I moved back to Florida to kind of get my Florida residency so I could go to school there, to a state school. And then a couple months into that, I ran into my now husband again, randomly. It was like we ran into each other at a church that's the size of James River. It's thousands of people, and ran into each other and just decided to start talking. And we talked for a year and got married. So long distance.
When you went home from after your first year, and did you keep in contact with him at all?
No. No, I mean, we did for a little bit that summer. And then when I realized I wasn't going to go back, I was like, we don't need to keep doing this. Okay. I was 19. I wasn't interested in a serious relationship. And, he still had several years of college left to go.
Sure.
So.
What were your 3 jobs that you picked up?
Well, that summer I actually worked for my dad, and I learned how to weld and to cut and thread pipe, which at that time, when I got into junior high and high school, he quit the agricultural business and went into building commercial kitchens and like the fire suppression, especially. So I did that for one summer, and that was really fun. It was super interesting. And then I worked at 2 different restaurants, and then I worked for an orthodontist, and I loved that job. That was the best job I ever had. He was such a good boss, and I just loved like the whole process and watching how, teeth moved and all the geometry that goes into it. And it was fascinating. I loved it.
So of those jobs, then what did you decide to pursue when you went back to college?
Dental hygienist.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I never actually did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the next question is then, do you have a welder?
I don't. We just got a little solderer.
Yeah.
And actually my dad sold a bunch of welders when he retired. But I have thought about getting a welder. I'd have to relearn everything because it was a long time ago.
It's kind of like riding a bike.
But it was really fun.
That's hilarious. I'm going to
write that down.
I'm going to have my daughter, my youngest daughter, listen to this because we're actually talking about welding as a career.
It's a great career.
Yeah.
It's a great career. So many interesting things you can do with it.
There are.
And they need them all over the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
They do. So you went to college, studied dental hygienist.
No, I didn't actually go back to college.
Oh, you didn't?
Because by the time I had established my residency, because you have to live in Florida for a year.
All right.
By the time I'd established my residency, I was already like back in Texas planning a wedding. So, and then, and then we got married and we moved up here. Like our honeymoon was moving up to Springfield. And we got involved in another type of IBF church, Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, that was probably even more strict. I call it cult medium. And it was encouraged that women should not work. And Chris and I were really young and kind of navigating all of these different ideas. And I think even though intellectually we didn't necessarily agree, there was enough pressure and just repetitive teaching that it's so interesting that you can become indoctrinated even though intellectually you disagree with it. You hear it often enough and it becomes like a very real fear that if you leave this church, there's no other good churches. And if you leave this church, your family's going to fall apart. You're not going to love Jesus anymore. So we stayed, even though we didn't, it was very it rubbed us the wrong way, like all the time. And we were there a lot. And so I never went back to school, never got a job. And then once we left, we needed about 4 years to kind of heal from that. It was a pretty, because once you leave, you're cut off. Like those are your only friends because you don't know how to communicate with anyone else because everyone else believes differently than you and they're a threat. And so once you leave, you don't have any friends and you don't have any community. But we visited around, we found a great church that was just what we needed at the time. And it was geared towards people who had been hurt by different things, different churches like that. And it was very healing. The small group really walked with us through that healing process. And in the middle of that, we were also, there was also like this pressure in that old church where, women you stay home and you have babies. That's your entire life's purpose. And that was also taught in my church growing up. But this was like on another level. So leaving that and also living in that and experiencing infertility was a pretty difficult thing. And so leaving that, and at that point we were doing infertility treatments. But also like healing emotionally from all of that. It was a lot of emotional upheaval during that time. But Chris and I always stayed very close. Like it bonded us even more. It felt like it was us against the world at some point. On some level.
Sure.
But,
so there's a term that a lot of people have used in the past several years where they talk about deconstructing. And some people go so far as to say, like I'm just unpacking all the things that I've picked up as a kid, as a young person, as a young adult, and then they end up walking away from the faith, or they find themselves in circles that they, as a young person, never would have imagined themselves in. How's that? I mean, are you describing it in a way like an unpacking or a deconstructing? In some form or fashion?
Yes. So while we were at that old church, Chris actually, and that's his story to tell, but he kind of went through that whole deconstruction process for several years. And it really scared me because I was like, where's this going to end? I wasn't there yet. I just was like, I'm a pretty passive person. So I was just kind of along for the ride, even though I had my own ideas. Pretty passive. But he had kind of already gone through that whole process, probably partway through our next church, which is kind of when I started my whole deconstruction process. But, we came out, I think, with a stronger faith because of it, because it was ours. It was his own, and then I had my own. And, and I'm thankful we did before we had kids, mostly before we had kids, because I'm really thankful we get to raise them in, believing in a God that loves them and not a God that is in constant threat of judgment and damnation. They love God because he is lovable, not because they're afraid of going to hell. So.
Is that the concept that you grew up with?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. How many times I prayed the prayer and got baptized just because I was afraid of hell? Oh. I'm not sure.
Okay. Wow. What was it like then if somebody would have asked you in the midst of in those moments where you were struggling with infertility and you had this religious framework though that you were either in or you were wrestling with, what was your understanding of what God was like in those moments?
There were definitely moments of anger. I was also volunteering at the Pregnancy Care Center at that time, which I had to step away from because it ended up once I got really far into infertility treatments, that was a really hard thing to watch. kids be born into and be raised by families that weren't prepared for raising children. Having babies and raising children is they're two different things. And so that was hard to watch when I wasn't able to have kids. And so I had to step away. I think it's a great organization, but so there were definitely moments of anger and frustration. I think once we left that church, the anger kind of dissipated because I saw that I saw up close that there were other paths for women. It didn't necessarily need to be babies and children. Like if we had them, great. I got to the point where I was like, if we have them, great, but we actually have a really great life. Like we get to travel all over the world. We have a ton of fun. We're pretty free to do what we want. So, I think it helped to get out of that in a lot of ways.
So then you went on to have a couple of boys and you
Yes.
gave them fantastic names.
Yes. Atticus is our oldest and Tolkien is our youngest. Yeah.
How'd you decide on those names for your kids?
So I'd love to say that I read the book To Kill a Mockingbird and decided, but I watched the movie first, which Gregory Peck did such a great job. I'd never seen it. I'd never read the book. Chris introduced me to the movie and I just loved that he did the right thing. In a calm, quiet way. Like he just did the right thing, even if nobody was looking. He wasn't trying to get people's attention. He was just trying to do the right thing. And so for us, Atticus, before we even knew if we wanted kids, we knew that if we had a boy, his name would be Atticus.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then with Tolkien, Tolkien is Chris's favorite author. And we wanted to stay in the literary realm for names, and nothing else really fit. Yeah, we considered different names, but this was the one that we felt strongly about.
Are you drawn to literature like Chris is?
Yes. We probably read different things. He reads much more nonfiction than I do.
Fair enough.
I struggle with the nonfiction.
So what do you like to read?
Oh, what do I like to read? Mystery, fantasy, sci-fi. Yeah. I love a good big series where you just like you jump in and when you come out, you're like, where am I? What am I doing here? Where is this? I like to get lost in a whole other world.
Do you have a favorite author?
I love the book series Outlander. I think it's such a fantastic series. The writer, I love the writer. She's Catholic, so that really informs her characters. I love the way she researches different time periods and different cultures. That's when I can just dive in, and I feel like I'm just hanging out with my best friends.
Good. That's great. I'm like Chris. I generally read nonfiction, but I don't think there's a room for throwing shade on when people are enjoying reading and whatever it is, like,
yeah,
to have fun with it.
Yeah, I agree. I used to have a lot of shame about not reading enough nonfiction, and I needed to like improve myself. But I improve myself through story. I like the storyline, and I feel like I learned a lot from these characters.
Absolutely. And good writers are always teaching you or sharing something. And
yeah,
there's a way to learn from everybody. How far do you want to go up, like in your story, from having kids to? Because there's a couple of things I'd like to, just, no other things. Like you finish and then we'll.
Oh, I mean, I think I just wrote down through like having kids.
Okay.
There was a period where I suffered from postpartum depression after Tolkien was born. Yeah. But I found all the puzzle pieces for me that helped me get through that and recover. So
what was helpful there?
I realized through a process that it was really tied to my blood sugar. Like a lot of it was, just having babies and being exhausted, and Chris working, his regular job and his startup job. So he was always gone. 18-hour days. But a lot of that was my blood sugar. And so once I got into like exercising regularly, not eating a lot of sugar and taking supplements that helped balance my blood sugar, that has for me been a big part of it. And sunlight.
And sunlight. Yeah. Yes. I know you and Chris have done a lot of traveling. You like to travel. Where are some of the places that you want to go back to, or some of the places you want to explore?
So before we had kids, early in our marriage, we packed a couple backpacks and we just went to Europe for 2 weeks. And we took the train around and we hit like Paris, Rome, Venice, Florence, Pompeii. And those were all wonderful. For the first time overseas, we were just like in awe of all these things that we had read in our history books. Excuse me. And then we got to go to Malaysia and Vietnam and Singapore twice with Drury University. Chris was an adjunct professor there, and we got to be chaperones, quote unquote chaperones. And that was amazing. Just Malaysia is one of my favorites because it's just such a melting pot of like Indian, Chinese, Malay, a little bit of British colonial culture has remained, but most of it is just this really beautiful combination. And we actually took the kids back there this fall to Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and then we also hit Istanbul on the way. And Istanbul, I can't wait to go back. Like we were only there a few days and just hit the highlights, but it was incredible.
What was remarkable about Istanbul?
It's literally the crossroads to east meets west. And it definitely reflects that even now. Like there's old Roman wall, there's miles and miles of old Roman wall. There's still aqueducts. There's mosques. There's still a couple of churches, but I think most of them have been converted to mosques. But there's just layer on layer on layer of major world cultures. Who it's interestingly when they've tried to, a lot of them wanted to preserve it, and Chris would know who did the preserving and all of that. I don't remember, but some of them really worked hard to preserve these old basilicas, and some of them tried to hide some of the iconography. Well, in the hiding of the iconography, they actually preserved it, whereas it would have like fallen apart over the centuries. Now it's been preserved, and when they uncover it, it's like perfectly preserved. So we got to see the Hagia Sophia. I'm not saying that correctly.
Hagia Sophia. Some people would say it like that or not like that. Yeah.
And then the Blue Mosque was beautiful, which they kind of are. They're in the same little section, and they almost like face each other. But they're just beautiful, and they're beautifully lit at night. So even just walking around at night, they're all carpeted, like the entire thing, and everybody takes their shoes off. So it was just so interesting to me because that's just not something that's typical in American culture, but the entire thing is carpeted and everybody's walking around in their bare feet, and there's cats. Istanbul has like neighborhood cats. They're not feral, but they're not really tame, and they're just everywhere, but not in like a gross way. Like, they're just there, and I never saw a rat the whole time. It was beautiful and but still very European. Like it feels very old world, but still also very cosmopolitan.
Sure.
So a lot of high fashion as well.
What are you looking forward to in the near term or long term future?
I think we're at this really fun stage with our kids that they're becoming who they will be, and it's fun to watch. Like I think they started really young, but it just like you don't always recognize it when they're little because you're just so busy trying to keep them alive and train them as much as you can. And but it's just really fun to see like the people that they're going to be. And so I'm looking forward to that. I mean, Atticus is almost 12, so we don't have that much longer with him. And I mean, we have probably 10 years of, actual like in-house parenting. I don't know. I'm guessing. You would know that more than I would. But
when I was 38, somebody that I was serving as a pastor to had a son who was also 38 who was getting ready to get married. And he looked at me and he said, being a parent of adults is the hardest task of parenting.
Oh, man.
Your roles shift and change. As you've already, you've already gone through a bunch of that discovery.
Yeah.
You know, because when they're so little, they depend on you for everything.
Yes.
And then at 12, the dependency is reduced.
It is.
In measure or in part.
Yes.
Or in kind. Maybe.
Yes. Yeah. And it's fun to see, like, as they get to experience more away from you, the feedback is really interesting. Like, Atticus got to go to Silver Dollar City with friends. Chris was there, but there was friends and moms and things like that. And I wasn't there. And another mom said it was really interesting to watch how, you know, the friends were putting pressure on the other friends to go on these roller coasters. And Atticus was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And he was not willing to do whatever anybody wanted him to do just to be included. And I don't know, I was really proud of him. I was like, oh, channel that for good, please.
Yeah. What's on your playlist?
On my playlist? Well, obviously I just listened to the new Taylor Swift double album. That was really interesting. I liked it. It was unusual for her, but I really enjoyed it. But mostly I listened to the same stuff I listened to when I was 14.
Which is?
Oh, goodness. Meredith Brooks, Backstreet Boys, a lot of one-hit wonders. Just fun light music. I have like my fun playlist. I have my melancholy playlist. I have my worship playlist. I have just different ones, but it's mostly stuff that came out a long time ago.
I think we all do it at some measure.
Yes.
Develop a sense of a grooveyard of forgotten favorites, as someone once said. What do you think deeply about these days?
I feel like most of my mental energy goes into like how to parent well to very different personalities and parent them each separately and parent them in their relationship, and then also create like space for Chris and I and space for one-on-one with each child and all of that. I feel like a lot of my mental energy goes into that.
Are you finding some good answers or things that satisfy?
Yes. I feel like there's such power in small community and having just like some really good mom friends who are maybe one season ahead of you in life and that you can run things off them. Like, we're dealing with this situation and, you know, what would you do? What are your experiences in that? That has been invaluable to me.
Mm-hmm. So, reflecting back on your childhood when you were living in this migrant community, you had people coming and staying at your house who were undocumented. You had people who were coming to become missionaries to learn Spanish, and then every day in the news it seems like there's people commenting on people who are undocumented. How does all that fit in with your with what you think about, and how do you process all that?
You know, I don't watch the news very often, but honestly, the most I hear is mostly from people asking me this question, like, what was that like? Or what do you think about what you're seeing now? And honestly, it was such a normal part of our daily lives. Like, I went to school with people who lived in Mexico and came across to go to school at this private school. We went across to Mexico all the time. Our dentist was in Mexico. We would go and buy our medications in Mexico. We went down all the time. It was just a normal part of our daily life. And the people that would come across, when you get to know them and you get to know their stories, like we had one man who he would come up from very deep in Mexico, and he would come up and he would stay 6 weeks, and he would work around our property, and he would work, he would travel around the area and just do manual labor, and he was just earning money, and he would take it back to his kids, or, his wife and his kids. And one time he came up and he was just devastated. He was crying. And my dad spoke Spanish. We never learned much Spanish. But he was telling my dad that when he had gone back, he found out that his youngest son had died, and he didn't know for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that was devastating. But then he still had to come back and work and earn money. And he, my dad would offer to let him stay in our house, and he would never stay in our house. He always just wanted to stay in the barn. And then if my dad, for a period of time, my dad traveled a lot because he was working in the import-export business. And so if my dad was gone before, his name was Pepe, before Pepe left, Pepe would stay until my dad got back, and he would, we felt safer when Pepe was around. And we always trusted him. And then, at some point he just stopped coming back, and we don't know what happened to him. Well, we'll just not ever know that. But he was a very big part of our childhood, and it was just normal. And then we had another woman who she did our ironing, because of church and school and work, we had a lot of ironing that my mom couldn't keep up with. So this lady did our ironing, and she was married to a wealthy man in Mexico who was very abusive, and he was trying to take their daughter. And the judge told her, your husband has paid me off, but I'm going to give you an hour to get out of here. She got on a bus with nothing but her daughter, and she came across the border, and she lived in very terrible conditions in order to make a life where her daughter was safe. And her daughter ended up being sponsored to become a citizen, and she's an incredible woman. She has her PhD, and she works with migrants, trying to help facilitate that. So all of these stories were just part of our daily lives. And looking back, I don't think I appreciated it back then. It was just normal. But I feel really lucky to have grown up in that multicultural area. So
thanks for sharing that, and for sharing those stories of real people. Because a lot of real people stories don't get shared in a lot of places today. Yeah. And everybody's got a story. So have anything on your bucket list? Ever thought about a bucket list?
A bucket list. I don't know. I feel like I have such a good life that I just appreciate what we have, and anything else is like what we have is like our experiences and our relationships. Anything else it's just frosting. Yeah, I'm not the forward thinker of the family. That's Chris's job. I'm the present thinker. So I don't know. Anytime we get to go travel, it's great. My parents just moved up from South Texas. So Chris and I spent the first 15 years of our marriage with just us. And then his parents moved into Springfield about 5 years ago. And then his sister and brother-in-law and their 4 kids. And then now my parents are here. So we have like a whole big family that
your tribe keeps growing.
Yes. Comes with all its beauty and challenges.
Yeah.
So
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, one final question. I've asked a lot of folks along the way if they've got a final word of advice.
I feel like the message that God keeps impressing on me lately is just like there's just this thread that connects me to Jesus. I just picture it as like this cord, and there's all these other things that are going on. And sometimes I get distracted with all of the other things. And I was laughing at myself because I'm picturing it. And I'm like, it's like all of these waves. And then I'm like, oh, wait, that's in the Bible. That's Peter. But just to just keep a hold of that cord and just keep focusing on that cord that connects me to Jesus. And things will settle out. There'll be other storms, but it'll be okay. That's
a great word. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks for this.
Yeah. A big thank you to Courtney for sharing her story with us. In listening to Courtney, I hope you were inspired, encouraged, and challenged, and that you begin to behold the really cool people that are around you each and every day. The Really Cool People podcast is produced by Schweitzer Church, Springfield, Missouri. Taylor Likes is our executive producer and editor, and I'm your host, Jason Leininger. You can help us by liking, reviewing, and sharing this podcast. Until next time, stay cool.